an ACT which legalizes the transformation of Czechoslovakia into a colony of the Soviet revisionists. Article published in the newspaper Zuriai Populit, the 23rd of October, 1968. These days, as has been announced, the Sokal-led Soviet-Czechoslovak Treaty, which legalizes the enslavement of Czechoslovakia by the foreign occupation troops and its complete colonization by the Soviet revisionists, came into effect. In order to camouflage their aggressive and neo-colonialist aims, the Moscow revisionist S&D, their spokesman, allowed a proclaiming the Soviet-Czechoslovak Treaty as an expression of the free will of equal parties, as a means of defending socialism from West German and revanchism, and so on and so forth. Booty this is rubbish. The treaty has further exposed its authors, stripped them naked and revealed their true nature of imperialist aggressors and counter-revolutionary renegades from the peace-loving peoples of the world. The treaty is a scandalous example of the cynicism and lane of the Soviet revisionists, further evidence of their aggressive and imperialist policy, right from the start. In its first clause, the document reveals the essence of the tank diplomacy because it speaks of an agreement between the aggressor and his victim, an agreement concluded subsequent to the ACOM. 516 Enver Hoxha published fact, after the complete military occupation, under the menace of artillery and tanks, the Soviet occupation troops present in Czechoslovakia will remain there forever. The fact is admitted in clause 1, which states that the number of Soviet troops and the places were The means legalization of the occupation regime in Czechoslovakia and its complete dependence on the Soviet military occupation command. Further proof of the cynicism of the Soviet revisionist invaders can be found in Clause 2 of the infamous treaty, which claims that the stationing of Soviet troops in Czechoslovakia does not violate its sovereignty, that the Soviet troops do not interfere in the internal affairs of the senior of Czechoslovakia, that they will respect the Czechoslovak laws. 3 ought to be a limit even to demagogy and cynicism, but for the Soviet revisionists there is no limit. The holy world saw that after the 21st of August the sovereignty of Czechoslovakia was crushed under the Soviet tanks, that the Soviet marshals Yakubovsky and Pavlovsky, together with the Golita Kuznetsov, made themselves masters in another's house, that the violence of invaders replaced the Czechoslovak law. The treaty sanctions colonial-type privileges for the Soviet revisionist occupiers. Under Clause 3 of the treaty, the puppet government of Prague is bound to put at the disposal of the Soviet occupation troops barracks and dwelling houses in the garrison towns, service buildings, depots, etc., airfields and stationary installations and other equipment, means of the state network of communications and transport, electric power and other services. Likewise, the shooting ranges and training grounds of the Czechoslovak army will be used by the Soviet occuper. The occupation of Czechoslovak will Sekcernik Svoboda to the miserable Tion troops. With these provisions, the Czechoslovak army which has been reduced by the collaborationist trio dub Sekcernik Svoboda to the miserable role of a stage extra, will no consider itself a stranger in its own home. In fact, this infamous treaty does not in any way recognize the existence of Czechoslovakia as a sovereign state with its own independent socio-economic and juridical order. After trying to solve the Czechoslovak problem manu military, by military violence, the Soviet revisionist imperialists have put themselves in the position of master in the house and settled themselves comfortable at the Czechoslovak table. The have created such privileges for themselves as to enable them to dictate their neo-colonialist will over the whole of this counter in politics, in the economy, in the socio-cultural field. The Soviet occupation troops and their families can enter or leave Czechoslovakia whenever they wish, without enter or exit visas or customs control. Clause 4 says explicitly, the Soviet army units, the persons who are part of the effective of the Soviet troops and the members of the families of these persons can go to the place where the Soviet troops are stationed in the senior of Czechoslovakia and return from the senior of Czechoslovakia both by direct trains and carriages which belong to the Soviet Union, or by changing from the carriages of the one counter to those of the other, or by air or motor transport. Those persons who are part of the effective of the Soviet troops and the members of their families will not be subject to passport or visa control during their enter to stay in or departure from the senior of Czechoslovakia. With HTS provision, the Czechoslovak state border, which symbolizes the sovereignty and integrity of that country, has been turned into a foot rag, into a broken down and worthless fence. The occupation regime and the complete capitulation 518 Enver Hoxha and submission of the Dubsek Svoboda revisionist TCL is also sanctioned by Clause 5. Under this clause the Czechoslovak side agrees to allow crossing of the state border of the senior of Czechoslovakia tax-free and without customs or border control, by the Soviet troops and persons who are part of their effective, including units, subunit S and army commands, all kinds of military cargo, including those destined for trade and communal purposes of the Soviet troops. Persons WHO are part of the effective of the Soviet troops. WHO enter or leave the senior of Czechoslovakia alone or accompanied by the members of their family LIES, which their personal effects. On presentation to the customs organs of their document sent allowing them to cross the state border of the senior of Czechoslovakia. Further proof of the complete dependence upon the WLL of the occupier is the fact that LL trade and communa L services for the effective of the Soviet troops on Czechoslovak territory WLL be provided through the Soviet trade and communa L enterprises. The implementation of this treaty WLL inevitable entail a great confusion in the whole economic, commercial and financial life of the counter Y&D WLL make the life of the Czechoslovak working people more difficult. 3 privileges granted to the invaders to use the local currency in trading, that is, to put into circulation uncontrolled amount of Czechoslovak banknotes. WLL inevitable led to disorder in the whole current system of the country, to inflation and the further flourishing of the black mark T and economy C speculation. Above ELL, the Czechoslovak puppet government is obliged to supply the occupation troops with food and industrial products, thus tightening the belt on the people, on the working masses. TSIS an unforeseen extra burden, a heavy impost which WLL be a further blow to the Czechoslovak economy, already staggering under our 3 revisionist reforms. The occupation of Czechoslovakia 519. The true face of the Soviet revisionists as aggressors and imperialist invader SIS clearly revealed also in those provisions of TS infamous treaty which bear on the application of the local LAW to the occupation troops. Their responsibility for the penal offences and contraventions committed by these troops on Czechoslovak soil in fact. Point B of Clause 9 of the treaty openly and brazenly sanctions the complete exemption from responsibility of the effective of the Soviet troops WHO commit crimes or otherwise violate either LAW in the performance of their duties in the region, where the armed units are stationed. In real TS means that the Czechoslovak law WLL never be applied to Soviet troops, because they can wash their hands of arbitrary action or crime they commit, as they are supposedly performing their duties and the whole of Czechoslovakia may be considered a region for the stationing of Soviet military troops. Final lie. In the same clause the treaty recognizes the jurisdiction of the Soviet courts in Czechoslovak territory, the competences of the Attorney's Office and other Soviet organs which WLL act on the basis of Soviet laws in Czechoslovak territory. TS is a revival of the savage colonial law of capitulation which ISTLL enforce in a few out-of-the-way colonies of Britain and Portugal. TSIS tantamount to the recognition of extraterritorial rights, of the UNLMID freedom of the invaders to act as and when they wish, in the name of the occupation LAW and contra Y to the laws of the country, thus scornful ly deriding the national dignity of the Czechoslovak people. Understandably, the effective and permanent presence of the Soviet occupation troops in Czechoslovakia, which this treaty no W legalizes, WLL exert its influence in all directions on the foreign policy of that country. Already why the Czechoslovak collaborationist chieftains have begun to jump to attention, to the commands of the Soviet OC 520 Enver Hoxha peers, to obey them in complete servitude and do what they dictate. The foreign policy of the puppet government of Prague has now been official ly set on the rails of the hegemonic interests of the Soviet revisionist occupiers, and, thus, under these conditions, it can never represent the aspirations and sovereign interests of the Czechoslovak people and can never defend their veto rights. The spirit and provisions of TS colonialist treaty which has been imposed on Czechoslovakia are by no means concessions to lighten the occupation, as Cerny K says, but in fact they legalize this occupation and make the burden of it heavier. TSIS a dictated treaty and in no way based on mutual understanding, as the revisionist Kosygin shamelessly lies. TS treaty is based on the bayonet S&D tanks of the Soviet revisionist occupiers. Brezhnev S. Rad. Pravda. Right S about unity and equality. Booty what unit y can there be between the occupier and the occupied? What equality y can there be between the rider and the horse? 15 clauses of this enslaving neo-colonialist treaty are 15 new strong knots in the noose placed around the neck of the Czechoslovak people. It is an outcome of the fascist type aggression against Czechoslovakia, which this treaty, the freedom, sovereignty and national dignity of the Czechoslovak people have been legal ly and final ly buried. The holy spirit of the treaty, its purposes and the way of applying it are very similar to those by which Hitler imposed his new order on the European Quislangs or to the agreements between the present-day Hitlerites, the American imperialists, and their small partners. In this shameful document there is not the slightest reference to the normalization of the situation in Czechoslovakia and the final withdrawal of the occupation troops. The dictate, prepared in Moscow and signed in Prague, the occupation of Czechoslovakia 521 GU, does not end but further deepens the crisis of the Soviet revisionist CLI and the holy revisionist front in Czechoslovakia and everywhere else. It further aggravates the difficult political, economic and social situation in the Soviet Union itself. and the relations between the different revisionist TCL and D countries. In particular, it inevitably makes the irreconcilable contradictions between the Soviet revisionist invader S&D the freedom-loving Czechoslovak people deeper and more bitter. Seeking to legalize its criminal actions of an imperialist and colonialist by means of a so-called bilateral agreement. The revisionist leadership of Moscow has treaty in Vienna to deceive world publici opinio and with this treaty. Booty with this new act the Soviet revisionists have once again exposed themselves as aggressors, invaders, exploiters and imperialists. As for are the Dubček Cerny clique. By signing this title to occupation, it branded itself once again as a group of renegades, collaborationists and quislings. Booty the Czechoslovak people contemptuously reject this act which legalizes the colonialist occupation of their homeland. The why have accepted neither the aggression, the occupation, nor the treaty of the Soviet revisionist aggressors, but on the contrary, they have denounced and opposed all of them, together with the betrayal and capitulation by the Dubček Cerny Svoboda trio. The fraternal Czechoslovak people, WHO have great revolutionary traditions, led by their working class and the revolutionary Marxist-Leninists. Certainly extend their resistance and fight with determination and with ever means, even with arms, against the foreign occupiers and the local traitors, for the sacred cause of national liberation and the restoration of the dictatorship of the proletariat, against modern revisionism 1968 to 1970.